Hey guys, welcome to the Multiply Podcast. We are in our second episode now, and for this episode specifically, I just really wanted to share something that's been a heavy burden on my heart, and really just speak to our at least our base audience for now, the Romanian-American, immigrant American kind of church, and also speak to a broader audience as well. And so, over the last 20 years. Almost 25 years in ministry, but for the last 20, I've been traveling a lot. And I've traveled to many different churches and many different communities, and I've spoken in many different places. And through years of counseling and of ministry and of sitting down with pastors and other ministers and young people before and after services and camps and conferences and every other thing you can imagine, all of these different conversations that we would have. One of the things that's kind of happened automatically is it's really given me a finger on the pulse of what's happening across the United States in our immigrant American community. And out of all the different ministers and other people that I've met with, as I travel, they typically will ask me, Eddie, what do you see as you travel? Because I travel a lot. In fact, I would even argue that I don't think there's another minister that travels nearly as much as I do in the U.S. for the Romanian-American younger generation. And so in my travels, there's a lot that I've seen and a lot that I've experienced, and that's really what I'd like to talk to you about, this burden that I have for this generation that my wife and I have, and then also at the same time, what we see and where we see things heading. And it's a really exciting time, and it's a really burdensome time, and it's a time where I think that we are on the precipice of tremendous growth and revival and change, and I'm very, very excited. And I just wanted to share with you this burden that's on my heart and on Simida's heart as well. So, yeah, within every generation's unique. Every generation's unique. And each unique generation has their own identity, that they have, and their own impact that they have, and their own legacy that they leave behind. Each generation of people receives a heritage from the previous generation's legacy and leaves a legacy for the next generation to inherit. That's just very, very common all throughout, history and mankind. And when I think about, our parents' generation, my parents' generation, they have a very unique legacy that they will always be known for and remembered. And that's part of our inheritance. You look at different legacies in different generations all throughout the U.S., and there's many different ways that we identify generations, right? We identify them by letters sometimes, right? Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. Sometimes we identify them by different experiences that they've had. The greatest generation, right, is the generation of people that went to World War II, and that's what they were referred to as. Sometimes by different experiences, right? So like the boomers, the baby boomers are named that because they were the generation of people that were born during the baby boom that happened directly after World War II, when all the soldiers came back home and they were, separated from their families for years and now entering a great time of peace, one of the greatest times of peace ahead of them. And so there was just this huge boom of babies, and then sometimes just by where you find yourself in life, like the millennial generation just happened to be the generation that went over the millennia from 1999 to 2000. And, each one of these generations has received a heritage from the previous generation and left a legacy for the next one. These generational identities are specific to each generation. Typically, by the way, whenever I say a generation, if you look up Wikipedia, if you look up other places and articles, it's typically referring to like 40, 50 years. So a people group within like 40 to 50 years, somewhere around there. But the question that I have then is, what about our generation? What about the Romanian Americans, the children of immigrants who came here to the United States, established us here, and we were either born in Romania and came over at a young age, or we were born here in the States and were raised here in the States? What would be the identifying marks for our generation? It's probably people between the ages of like 10 and 55. That's where most of these people would kind of, we would find ourselves. We're a generation of people who, much like the baby boomers, were a byproduct of our parents' generation. Our parents came to the U.S. during communism, were raised in a communist society, brought us here, and we were raised here in the U.S. in a Western society, but really raised in an immigrant bubble. We were very much closed off in our communities, but still surrounded by a completely different experience with a Western worldview, but surrounded by with an Eastern worldview, right? But surrounded by a Western worldview within our culture. And those two things at times were of great benefit to us, and at other times they were something that just clashed and created a lot of drama. But the question is okay, so what is our heritage? What is the legacy that our parents left us? Because in order to understand who we are, we also have to understand where we've come from. And so, as I look throughout Scripture and obviously, as a pastor and as somebody who studies the Word and somebody who's devoted their life to this, I see a lot of similarities in a lot of different stories. And I see a lot of similarities in Moses' story. See, Moses was a baby who was born in poverty and in a people who were enslaved by an oppressive regime. Moses was somebody who was born to parents who loved God, but were born in a really difficult situation. Moses grew up in a very unique way, though, because he was born underneath condemnation, but because his parents were God-fearing, God-loving people, they took him, placed him in a basket, and then he ended up in the wealthiest place that he could end up. If that's not our story, I don't know what is. Moses was raised in the palace of Pharaoh, the wealthiest kingdom on earth at the time. And so the wild thing, though, is that Moses never forgot his heritage. And so even though he was raised in the palace, he always understood that God had great call upon his life and that there was provision and that there was purpose and that there was calling out of his heritage that would only then lead him to his destiny. And so if you look at our history, we were born underneath an oppressive regime, the regime of communism, the regime of Ceausescu. And our parents, because they were God-fearing, God-loving people, took great, gigantic risks to their own lives, to their own safety. Many of them were beaten. Many of them were imprisoned. Some of them, their bones are still bleaching what were known as the forests of Yugoslavia at the time. There in the sun because they were gunned down and killed. Some of them beat to death, some of them beaten and broken. Not everybody made it, but they were great pioneers and risk takers, and they risked everything for religious freedom and came here to this country, not for us to be lost in our identity of what we've risked and what our parents have risked and done, but in order for us to continue to fulfill what it was that God had called us to do. And I just want to say that God has a calling for our generation. Our parents didn't instill in us a heritage of loving God and risking their lives so that we could arrive here in America and lose our souls to the richness of this land. And there's more to it than that. And so our parents left us a legacy. Their legacy, their identity will always be, for the rest of my life and my children's life, the generation that withstood communism. They will always be the generation that endured torture and persecution, that were unbending in the face of evil, that escaped to a land of freedom and blessing to raise their children freely in Christ. See, I remember when I was a kid, we grew up in my house without a TV because Christianity, especially Pentecostalism back in Romania, was extremely strict. Like even haircuts were not allowed, for those of you that know that. So if you became a Pentecostal, you had to shave your head. And had a lot to do with the holiness movement, and had a lot to do with a desire in pursuing holiness and in living in simplicity and taking away any sort of distraction. But I remember growing up here in the States, we didn't have a TV growing up at all. And as kids, we really wanted a TV because we would see them different places and so on. But our parents were very, very strict because they were very serious about their Christianity. Not that there's a problem with having a TV, don't get me wrong, but in their point of view at that time, it was a huge issue. And so because of that, they just said, you know what, no, we'd rather live in seclusion from all of the effects of the world. But I do remember one time, my dad brought a TV into the house, and I'll never forget it, because as a kid, my world went upside down. And I remember my dad brought in a TV. It was right around Christmas time, and I was so excited because I thought that for Christmas, we got a TV. But that wasn't the case at all. It was 1989. And it was Christmas Day, if I'm not mistaken, that my uncle had come over. And I remember in our family room, sitting there on the hearth, right where the fireplace was, there was this TV, and my dad and my uncle Darrell were sitting around it watching it. And we would come in and watch it as well. And we asked if we could watch things, and they said no, because they were watching something on the news. And it was wild. I remember my memories that there was so much joy in the room of my dad and my uncle and my mom and my aunt and, some of my older brothers. I was little. I didn't understand. I was about, 5 years old, 6 years old. And I was sitting there looking at all of this and listening to my mom and my dad, and listening to my dad and my uncle as they would, talk about, with excitement, things that they were pointing out on the TV. But what was happening on the TV that I didn't know at the time was that Romania was going through a revolution and communism had fallen. It was being overthrown and it was being televised on TV. And my dad would point out different things in the city square and so on, because it happened to have started in the city that we lived 7 kilometers just outside of. It's just 7 kilometers outside of Timișoara was Săcălaz, where I was born, where my parents had lived. Timișoara is where Popa Șapcă was, the prison that my dad was imprisoned in for 14 months. I mean, that's their stomping grounds. That's what they knew. And it was so wild. I remember watching my dad and my uncle with so much excitement talk about the future and talk about hope and talk about, the church and talk about their Christianity. But somewhere underneath all of that, even as a little kid, I feel like you could totally tell that there was this lingering, deep sadness. Something else was lingering underneath the surface. And it's one of the very few times, I think 2, maybe 3 times in my life, that I've seen my dad shed a tear. And I remember he sat there, and as they were talking about the future, my uncle and my dad were talking with hope. But as they began to reminisce about the past, that's when I'd see them with tears in their eyes, talking about what they suffered and what they endured and what they went through. And talking about how, thankful they were that even though they endured those things, that, the people in Romania that were still there no longer had to endure that level of persecution, and how much of an impact that had made. And I'll never forget those moments. That's our parents' generation's legacy. Last Christmas, the one that just passed, as powerful as that scene was in my life, and as powerful as many of you have your own scenes when communism fell, last Christmas was 35 years since that day. 35 years since communism fell. Our parents' struggles are real, they're powerful, they're known, and they're shared. People sit around campfires and we go camping and we still tell stories about things that happened during communism and about coming to America and about establishing our faith here. Old men tell their grandchildren how their scars were fashioned in resolve and in determination. I remember sitting around when I was a kid at campfires when our church would go camping, and I would have older men show me scars about places where they were beaten and they were bruised and they were harmed and hurt and taken through all sorts of experiences. And I would sit around and we would sit there and we would eat slanina, which is smoked bacon, and we would eat sunflower seeds, and we'd sit around the campfire and we'd hear all of these stories about our parents' generation and where we came from, in commitment to a belief that was greater than pain, suffering, and even death, how their faith was forged. We would hear about how their commitment to Jesus was resounding, and it's true, their fervency in prayer. There's a lot of things that as I travel and I meet with young people, and I've met with, people in their mid-30s, mid-40s, and 50s, and we would talk about, our parents' generation, about, different strengths and so on. And sometimes, there would even be complaints about, this or that, or, we could have done this better, or we could have done that better. But the funny thing is one thing that everybody agrees on is our parents' generation took their Christianity extremely seriously. It mattered to them. It did not matter, the smaller things didn't necessarily matter. It is not always, necessarily a hill to die on. People would disagree about different things, about what was good and what was bad. But one thing that we all agreed on, their Christianity was extremely serious to them. It mattered to them exponentially. Yeah, they didn't need a manual to follow, or a book to read, or a podcast to watch. They had faith and prayer and a determination and an attitude of no matter what it takes, we're going to get there. This was our parents' generation's struggles when they had to face communism and deal with all of that. But what I want to say about our generation is these weren't our struggles. I never had to fight the communists. I never suffered because I told people that I'm a Christian. I didn't grow up in communism. I didn't stand in bread lines waiting for bread or milk or butter or gas or whatever. I wasn't beaten for helping people. The secret police didn't guard my house or follow my wife around looking to do her harm, or I didn't have to worry about my children being taken from me or killed. I didn't have to worry about, going to the guard's barracks whenever the guard would call you and he would question you and you weren't exactly sure how things would go. I didn't have to worry about being beaten until unconsciousness only to wake up to another beating. This wasn't my experience. I didn't grow up in communism. My generation didn't grow up in communism. But we did grow up in the echo of communism. We grew up with, we grew up in the shadow of communism. I remember there's a phrase that I would hear in my house all the time, and I didn't know that it was a communist phrase. It's a funny thing, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. But I always grew up hearing that, if you don't know how, we'll teach you. If you can't, we'll help you. If you don't want to, we'll make you. And that was just a common phrase that I had grown up hearing my whole life. I didn't know that that was a quote of Lenin's. You see, I didn't grow up in communism. My generation didn't. But we did grow up in the shadow of communism. But I will say this, today the echo is quieter and the shadow is more faded. And every year that goes by, that history and that legacy is fading more and more and more, for better or worse. The suffering for better, the overcoming and the endurance for worse. It's funny, whenever I go to Romania and I hang out with my Romanian friends, which I still go to Romania from time to time, whenever I hang out with my Romanian friends, the weirdest thing happens. I noticed this like 10, 15 years ago, where I would hang out in Romania and my Romanian friends would introduce me to their friends. And they'd say, hey, this is my American friend, or my friend from America, Eddie Frangel. And they always introduce me with the title of America. But whenever I hang out with my friends here in the States, to this day, people go, hey, this is my Romanian brother, Eddie Frangel. And it's the funniest thing because I know that the Romanians from Romania are very different than me and my generation. I also know that the Americans from America, that I stick out like a sore thumb. We do in our culture and our community. And it's so funny because we know that we're not like the Americans here in America, but we're also not like the Romanians in Romania. And so we're very clear on what we're not, but we're not so clear on what we are. Now, why is this important? It's important to understand where we come from, because in order to understand who we are and where we're headed, we need to understand who we've come out of and where we've come from. God has us on a trajectory. Look, in graphing, if you can figure out a point of where you are and a second point of where you've come from, you can draw a line between those two things and then see the trajectory of where it is that you're headed. And in understanding where we've come from and where we are today, it'll give us a much clearer understanding of where the Lord's leading our generation. If you look at Moses' story, Moses came out of slavery and subjugation. He found himself in the palace, and on that trajectory, the Lord was leading him not to be lost in the poverty of the palace, but even through a series of events, even though, things didn't work out in the palace because of killing the Egyptian, and then he ended up, fleeing. At the end of the day, it still led him on the trajectory to find wealth in the wilderness. So then the question is who is our parents' generation? In order to understand where we're headed, if we know where we are, then first we have to understand where we've come from. And I just have a couple of things I want to say about our parents' generation. Number one, they were a generation of faith. There's a great verse in Psalms 46, verse 1, where it says, God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. They were a people of faith. They trusted God, not because they had no other option. They trusted God because they had no other option if they were going to be unyielding in their commitment to Jesus. They had to go through the suffering that they went through, or withdraw in their faith, which they weren't willing to do. So then the only way forward was whatever was ahead of them. The enemy would roar and foam at the mouth, desiring to snuff out their belief and their lives, but they had faith. I remember a story that my father told me, which I think we all have stories with our parents, but I remember a story that my father had told me when we came to America. See, we came to the States in 1985. Oh, I'm sorry, in 1986. And when we came to the States, my father had already had quite a few problems with the Securitate. He had 3 serious marks on his record against him in a really thick dossier outlining from the Securitate, the secret police, the communist secret police, outlining all of the different offenses that he had committed against the communist regime. three serious marks on his record that the communists had against him. So he had these major problems that would not allow him to be able to immigrate to the U.S. Now, these three problems, one of them was my sister at the age of 10, she had gotten sick, and due to the extremely poor health care in Romania, she was left mentally handicapped from the age of 10 forward. So she was really sick. She was mentally ill. And then during the physical that they would have to do for the husband, the wife, and the children, whenever you're looking at immigrating to the States, applying for asylum, if one of your children were that sick, typically they would reject you for it. So my dad was afraid that they would deny our family entry into America because of her condition. The second thing that my dad had was he had helped people flee the country. And because of that, he had spent 14 months in Popa Shapka prison, which is Pope's Hat prison. And while they were figuring out his case, he spent 14 months there, potentially going to face, 7 years at that point. But he ended up getting out after 14 months. That's a whole nother story. But he had this condemnation that he was in prison. And typically, if you apply for asylum in America and you have a prison sentence in your past, that's an automatic no. It's a really easy no for them. Thirdly, he was trapped by the secret police in Romania, the Securitate, in a buying and selling scheme that they used to jail him for 8 months in a work camp. And so he was a recidivist, right? Somebody who had been in prison multiple times. He had a daughter that was handicapped. And he had these three big problems. And I remember him telling me this story when I was a kid. And he said, Eddie, I had these three really big problems. And I went to a prayer meeting once at church. And I was sitting there and I was by myself in the back. And I was praying. And I said, God, I've got these three problems and I don't know what to do. And he goes, I'm going to go before the embassy. And he goes, I had some plans to maybe, swap out your sister with somebody else's daughter. Then when we go to get on the train, swap them back around. And then I had these different arguments, that I was going to make. And he goes, as I was sitting there talking with the Lord about it, us being Pentecostals, he goes, I'm at this prayer meeting and the Lord begins speaking prophetically through a lady. And all she says is this. She said, or the Lord said through her, you, O man, who has three grave problems on your heart, go straight, for I am with you. And he goes, when I heard those words, it gave me such a tremendous peace. And he goes, and I just went before the judge, the immigration judge at the time, and the Securitate, the communists had brought this really thick dossier out. And he goes, and I remember it to this day. She opened up the dossier and she began to read through it, and she just burst into laughter. She starts laughing and she takes out a black marker and she starts drawing X's through everything. And he goes, I had known at that point in time that the accusations against me for the prison sentences, that they weren't going to stick, but I was still worried about your sister. And he goes, I looked over. Now, my sister at the time, because of her condition, she would shake uncontrollably, and she had really bad balance issues. So she was constantly, had a light tremor, but you could tell, that something was off. And he goes, when we went in to do the physical, the children were all sitting, all five of you on the bench, and it was your mom and I. And he tells me the story of how when they went in for the physical, they did the physical on my dad, on my mom, and then they called out the kids, by name, and all the kids looked up just to, make sure that it was them. And then when my dad called them, my sister Lydia looked up and smiled, and she wasn't shaking, and she was totally on balance. And then the physician said, oh, it's okay. The children don't need a physical, and the children never even got up. And so everything went completely well, and then we just came to the U.S. When we applied for asylum. We went through a refugee camp in Italy for a short while, and then we arrived in Sacramento. And I remember, as a kid, and even now as an adult, as I tell the story again and I think about these experiences that we've had, this is my heritage. This is our parents' generation's legacy. As unpolished as things might have been here or there, man, they had a resounding faith that was unyielding and unbending. They were a generation of faith. Not just when it's comfortable, but when it counts. They constantly chose the hard right decisions over the easy wrong ones. Who was our parents' generation? They were also a generation of action. In Isaiah 41:10, it says, so do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. I remember we went camping once, and one of the men who was an administrator in our church in Sacramento, a great man, a guy that I really loved and admired. His name is Gigi Moga. He was telling us a story about how he came to the U.S. And he all of us young people were gathered around. And he said, he goes, when I came to the States, he goes, we fled and we crossed the Danube, the giant river on the south side of Romania. And he goes, when I had swam across it in the middle of the night, so that way the frontier, the border guards wouldn't catch us because we were trying to flee communism. He goes, I was going across the river, and his wife was, I believe, 18 at the time. And he goes, we got caught in a whirlpool. And he goes, and as I was sitting there on this inflatable mattress, I didn't know how to swim. My wife didn't know how to swim, but we wanted to risk our lives to escape and to find freedom. And we were stuck in this whirlpool. And he goes, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to die. My wife is going to die. What have I done? And he goes, and in that moment, he goes, I just cried out to God. I said, God, save us. And he goes, in the next few moments, I don't know what happened. I was thrashing about, but my hand hits dirt and I was on the other side of the river. And I remember as a kid hearing these stories and how much it would mark me to know that, it wasn't because of his poise or his theological excellence or because of any of these things, but it was just this raw, guttural trusting of the Lord, of risk-taking and pioneering and taking, your life into your hands and surrendering it to the Lord. I remember another story about another man named John, and he had shared with us, he goes, when he was fleeing communism in the middle of the night, he was also crossing a river, and he said, I got lost and I don't know which way to swim. It was dark. I was in the middle of the river and I was trying to swim across. He said, I remember I cried out to God in the middle of the river, and there was a light that had turned on one of the shores. And so he goes, I just began swimming for the light. And once I got to the other side, as I got near to the light, wondering, was it a flashlight? Was it a guard? What was it? As I got near to it, the light disappeared. And he goes, I got out, me and a friend of his. And he goes, and as we got out, we were sitting there, and very quickly from a different direction, two soldiers approached them. And he goes, and we didn't know what to do. Surely we knew that they saw us. We knew that we were in trouble. We were afraid that we would die. So we just got on our knees with our hands clasped together in front of us, and we just began praying. And he goes, those two guards walked right up to us, saw us praying, and kept on walking. And he goes, and to this day, I don't know if they saw us or if they didn't. But I know that we were on our knees praying, and these guards, whose job it was to catch people going across the border fleeing communism, they just kept on going. And you hear these stories of their legacy. You hear these stories of our heritage. You hear these stories of this faith that is unyielding and unbending in pursuit of a life, where they can have and practice religious freedom and pursue something better for their families. And you understand that our parents' legacy is a legacy of faith and is a legacy of action. They were doers. They didn't just talk about their Christianity. They lived it and they risked it. So I'm not going to suggest to you that the previous generation was perfect. I don't want to paint some picture that is unrealistic. No, they weren't. They had their shortcomings and their weaknesses as well. They came to America, and it seems like a lot of that same fire and passion and zeal was lost. It seems like we had passion and fire and zeal in our churches, but it didn't really expand beyond those walls. We didn't really pursue evangelism all that much in our communities and so on. We became, in some senses, a community that really focused on our community, but we were incredibly isolated. There wasn't a new model established in our new home. We were not, very effective at evangelizing our communities, right? A new generation of leaders was not heavily invested in or raised. So I'm not saying that it was perfect. Don't get me wrong. But I do want to take it for what it is and understand where we've come from. They had failures as well, like any other generation, and that is part of our heritage. But learning from our past mistakes and investing in the neglected areas of the past is the call of this generation. And you can never work on fixing something until you admit, hey, here are some things that we do have to work on. And so I don't shy away from that. I'm not perfect. Our generation isn't close to that either. But we have an identity in our heritage. God has an identity for us. We are not a people without a home. We're not a people without a calling. We're not a people without a legacy to leave. We didn't fight the communists, right? I never waited in a breadline. I don't know what it's like to be beaten for my faith or to put pillows in windows to hide from the Securitatis so we can have a prayer service. We don't know what it's like to be imprisoned and hated and beaten and reviled. I don't know what it's like to flee a country with small children to come to a promised land seeking opportunity and freedom. That is our parents' legacy. But it's important to understand that it is also our heritage. We have such a heritage. Often we find that we know who we're not, but we don't know who we are, right? So after 20 years of traveling this country, after thousands of conversation and many hours of prayer, can I tell you what I do see for our generation? I see an immigrant church established here in America that is a part of our parents' legacy. I see a church that is practical and walks out their faith. They are Christians who don't just hear and believe, but they hear, believe, and do their Christianity. If I go to a church and I do a fundraiser in a Romanian church, here's what will happen. If we go and Peter Boros, a good friend of mine who builds things and buildings all over the world, if he comes to a Romanian church and he says, brothers, there's a group of children that don't have a home and we need to build an orphanage in another third world country, in India, in Sri Lanka, and wherever. As Romanians, we will raise $20, $30, $50, $70, $100,000. But the other part of our Christianity is we'll go, hey, Pete, here's a check for $70,000, and there's 6 contractors who want to come with you to build it. We're not, by extension, Christian. We're involved in our Christianity. I see that in our church. I see a church that has an amazingly deep community. It's probably one of the things that we're extremely well known for. Each person is involved. I see a church who is passionate about prayer. When we pray, we pray. We're zealous in our prayer. We pray out loud because we believe in being involved in our Christianity. I see a church that is committed to living out the Christian life. I see a church that is focused around the family unit. We believe so much about having healthy, godly, biblically founded families and the raising of healthy families within God's design. If you remember the whole Barnevernet thing, which is the Child Protective Services of, I think, Norway or Finland or one of the Scandinavian countries, where there was the Bodnariu family, who the government officials had come in and taken away their children. And I forgot how many cities all over the world we had gathered together in the thousands and thousands protesting, because we believe in the healthy Christian family unit, and we stand opposed to anybody coming in and separating our family units. Now, if there's abuse, that's a different thing, but in this case, that wasn't abuse. It was the government overstepping and overreaching, and the church responded to it. Why? Because we believe heavily in that good, godly, Christian, healthy family. I see in the Romanian-American church a church that is enduring, that is filled with people who communism couldn't stamp out, not only couldn't break, couldn't bend, who suffered for their faith and who love God dearly. Now, that's what I see in our bubble, but let me tell you what I see outside of our bubble. I'll tell you what I see in the Western American church. I see a church that has powerful and well-articulated and well-established theology. That's something that we can learn from and grow from. I see in the Western church a church that is intentional in all that they do. That's something we can learn from and grow in our intentionality and in the way that we do church and the way that we do our Christianity. I see clear vision and direction, clear structure. I see a church that has a really great organizational structure, right? The ministry isn't hamstring behind inefficient processes. I see a church that honors their leadership. There's a place where we can learn as Romanian Americans. I love how the American church honors their leadership. And we do so as well, as long as we like the leadership. If we don't like the leadership, then everything kind of goes sideways. There's a pastor in 1991, just a year and a half after communism had fallen. He had said that if we could marry the strengths of the Church of the East with the strengths of the Church of the West, in our case, the Romanian and the American church, we would have the perfect church. What I want you to understand is that, look, our parents' generation will never know the Western American church like our generation knows the American church. And our children's generation will never know the Romanian church like our generation knows the Romanian church. All of the strengths and all of the weaknesses of both. For those of you, that were born and raised here in America or that are American, if you've ever been on missions, there are things that you see in the missional church that are great. You've ever been to South America or Brazil or Africa or Eastern Europe or China or, anywhere where you see the missional church, they have some amazing things where often as missionaries would come back and they'd go, man, in America, I wish we had, this zeal for prayer, this commitment to Christianity. But there are other things that we also see in those same places, in those same churches where we go, man, in the Western church, we get this a little bit more right or a little bit better. So the question then is, who is in a better position than us to be able to have a church that has the strengths of the East and of the West? And I do believe that God has a calling upon our generation to be a generation that bridges together and builds together. A church that has the strengths of the missional church, of the church that we find in mission, and yet at the same time of the church that is well established here in the U.S. We have an identity. God has an identity for us. We are not a people without a home or without a calling. and we have such a rich heritage in the amazing country that we live in. So then the question is, what is in store for our generation specifically? I'll tell you what I know. I know that, right, if we were to graph where we are and where we were, you can see a trajectory of where we're going to head. The truth is that many times you cannot understand your destiny until you begin living out of your heritage. Moses' destiny didn't begin until he began involving himself with the Israelites because he knew that those were the people that he came from. Things took quite a turn, but it put him on the track of fulfilling the destiny that he had, which came out of the heritage that he was born from. Our parents' struggle, their sweat, their blood, their years that they lost, the lives that were extinguished, the endurance that was forged by the fires of communism are the seeds of revival in our generation. God has a calling for our generation. It's to establish a new model that is founded on our heritage and is embracing God's plan and our legacy. And I don't necessarily mean that we have to uproot and change the model. Don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is we need to learn how to grow and move forward, building on top of what it is that our predecessors have been faithful and obedient in allowing God to build in them. So how do I live out my heritage? How do I live out my legacy? It's by living and knowing our heritage. So 2 things I would recommend. Number 1, go home and get to know your parents' stories. How did they get saved? You might assume that they were always Christian because for as long as you've known them, they've been saved. You would be wrong. You may be wrong. I'd encourage you to ask them, hey, Dad, when did you meet the Lord? If your aunts and uncles or your parents are still alive, if you're in your 50s and your parents are still alive, that would be a story that I wouldn't want to not know. Ask them exactly what their journey was like. How did they get saved, right? How has God worked in their lives or in their parents' lives? I'm sure they have stories that you've never heard. Next time you're with an uncle or an aunt, or you're out at an event or a family reunion or camping, ask them their stories. Next time you go camping and your parents are sitting around the fire or something, or your grandparents or your uncles and aunts, if you're fortunate enough to still have them alive, gather a few friends, gather your children together and ask your parents to share around the fire, but get to know your heritage. Know what it is that God's done in the previous generation. For what it is that God did in the previous generation, oftentimes he's doing that to build up to do what's in the next generation. Secondly, by embracing it. We come from a generation of ambitious, risk-taking pioneers. We were all raised in our churches, often to be obedient, play-it-safe managers who do these things because that's how they've always been done. But that's not who we were raised by. We were raised by the opposite. We were raised by ambitious, risk-taking pioneers. You know how you embrace your heritage? By building on it. So what I want to encourage us as Romanian-Americans is I want to encourage you, surround yourself with good pastors, surround yourself with good mentors, make sure that you're hearing from the Lord, be faithful and obedient. But listen to me. I want to encourage you to understand where it is that we've come from and encourage you to be pioneers as you pioneer forward. Be risk takers, be ambitious, pursue the Lord. When God's telling you to move, you don't need anybody else's permission. And I just want to encourage you, especially, looking at our current surroundings, Gen X and Gen Z, millennial generation and Gen Z, they are the entrepreneur generation. God didn't bring us to this country for us to lose our identity and our heritage in the wealth that we find here within this country, but instead rather to understand where we've come from and to be a generation of people that come out of pioneers and ambitious risk takers and to continue to be pioneers and risk takers and to do great big things. To do great big things and to risk and be available to serve the Lord in a way that is real and productive and awesome. Listen, you're gonna make mistakes. You're gonna fail. You're going to screw some things up. You're going to say some things that you're going to regret. That's just how the journey of pursuing the Lord goes. The only people who don't fail are the people who never try. The only people who don't say things that don't offend anybody are people who say nothing, do nothing, and are nothing. But at the end of the day, I just want to encourage you to be a risk taker like your parents were, to be a pioneer, to pray, to be faithful to whatever it is that the Lord is telling you to do. Look, sometimes we get so hung up on the idea of needing and wanting to do this giant, wild, crazy, adventurous ministry. And often the Lord does lead us into that. But what I want to encourage you to understand is, Luke 16:10 says, he who is not faithful in little will not be faithful in much. He who is faithful in little will be faithful in much, right? So faithful in little, faithful in a lot. I want to encourage you to be faithful in your disciplines. I want to encourage you to be faithful in understanding and reading the word. Sometimes we get so caught up in our experiences with God that we don't really want to build the disciplines of reading the Bible and prayer and fasting and all of those other things. We just want to have the great adventure. And I want to say to you that you need to be able to have solid disciplines in your life to give you a solid base and a foundation for the wild adventure that is that the Lord leads you on. And I'll tell you, in my own personal walk, the wild parts of my adventure began with a wild adventure, a fantastic adventure, a deep pioneering adventure in reading the word and in fasting and in prayer and in God breaking me down and crushing me and building me back up to be the man that he's called me to be. And the journey that my wife and I have been on from the first day when we met the Lord and until this day, and hopefully until our last day, has been a journey of challenge, of stretching, of joy, of weeping, of sorrow, of overcoming, of victory, of regrets and mistakes, and of great big outpouring and seeing God deliver and of celebration. And I wouldn't trade it for anything, but it begins in our disciplines. So often we get hung up in wanting deliverance and supernatural works. We want to see the gifts of the Spirit, but we don't have the fruits in our lives. And I just want to encourage you to grow in faithfulness. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that you're going to work on what you want to work on. Instead, I want to encourage you to just be faithful to do what it is that the Lord is telling you to do. And when you're faithful and you're working on what God wants you to work on, that's when the second and the third and the fourth thing begin to open up and you begin to move forward. And so I just want to encourage you to be a generation of pioneers, to be a generation that seeks to do great things for God, to be a generation that is unafraid, to be a generation that even when you are afraid, you're going to trust the Lord, even with fear sitting there in your heart or doubt sometimes coming up, that you will be committed to going, Father, I know where I come from. I know what you've done. I've seen your promises. I've seen you deliver, and I'm going to walk with you, O Lord, in a way that is real and honest and genuine because I want to fulfill what it is that you've set within my heart. And so I just wanted to encourage you and to look, to see, to understand, and to know what it is that I've seen and I've experienced and that I can share with you to encourage you to move forward. And I think that's it for today's podcast, but if you share in that burden with me, continue to pray for this generation. Continue to lift them up before the Lord. Continue to stand in the gap. Ask people to come around you. And let's walk with the Lord in a way that is real and honest and truly, 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 deeply profound. Love you guys. God bless.